with the Congress such a terrific opportunity to mark and to celebrate this milestone of the University of Victoria. What an amazing 50-year journey to get us here. From early days as Victoria College, starting in 1903, when first and second year arts and science courses from Montreal's McGill University were taught here on the island. Then in 1920 to a period when Victoria College became affiliated with the University of British Columbia, then to independent university status in 1963, and now 50 years later to being who we are today and to achieving the placements in global rankings that we have seen UVic achieve in recent years. So being given the privilege to host the Congress here at UVic in such a special and fantastic way to commemorate our 50th celebration is really special, and we thank the Congress for that. The theme of Congress this year is At the Edge, which not only, of course, reflects our geographical location on the west coast of Canada, but it's also about testing the boundaries of disciplines, promoting innovative thinking, and seeking relevance to both local and global communities, and committing to engaged scholarship and, of course, knowledge mobilization. Our theme then this year focuses on the key social challenges of inequality, the need for inclusivity and the acceptance of diversity, all to ensure that voices on the margins, on the edge, are heard. Enough from me. It is now my pleasure to introduce somebody else to say a few words, and that person is no other than the president of the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation, PJ Forrest. PJ, over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your warm welcome. My thanks as well to the University of Victoria for your hospitality, generosity in hosting this event. Il y a peu de programmes dont la Fondation est plus fière que ce programme de conférence Trudeau. Et au nom de la Fondation, je suis ravi de voir autant de gens présents aujourd'hui pour ce qui va être la dernière conférence de ce cycle de 2012-2013. So where to start? So just to be clear, we are not here to honor the former politician or his son. I was speaking of the filmmaker, of course. Despite its namesake, the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation has no political agenda. It's an independent and non-partisan Canadian charity whose sole mission is to carry on the intellectual tradition of the late Prime Minister. In fact, in many ways, our foundation's work mirrors that of the Federation for the Humanities and Social Sciences. Like the Federation, the Trudeau Foundation is in the business of promoting big thinking and nurturing innovation in the social sciences and the humanities. It's a hub for research and creation. We harness the drive and ambition of some of Canada's and the world's most promising and accomplished minds, whose far-reaching ideas are helping to solve issues of critical importance to Canadians. While we haven't been around nearly as long, and congratulate the Federation for more than 8 decades of outstanding public service, we share its conviction that a new idea excites its creators, leads to debate, and sparks discovery that drives people forward. Pierre Trudeau was a man notorious for challenging the status quo, from his earliest writings as a political activist to his policies as Prime Minister. He urged Canadians to think bigger and to do more to produce better results, to resolve a host of problems confronting society. Like-minded family, friends, and colleagues of the Prime Minister established the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation in 2001 to actively advance this goal. Its sole purpose is to make sure that creative ideas and essential knowledge find their way to the public sphere. La Fondation a bénéficié d'une dotation exceptionnelle de 125 millions de dollars du gouvernement du Canada en 2002, à la suite d'une résolution unanime de la Chambre des communes. Et nous avons fait fructifier cet investissement dans la recherche et l'innovation, notamment grâce à des dons privés. La Fondation est aujourd'hui la 11e fondation indépendante au Canada. The money has been put to good work, underwriting scholarships, fellowships, and mentorships that support outstanding individuals who can make meaningful contribution to societal challenges. We provide generous contribution and grants to the very best social science and humanities doctoral students. There's a few in the room. This is why I insist on generous. From Canada and around the world. Les prix Trudeau, qui eux ont une valeur de 225 000 $, consacrent l'originalité et la capacité d'engagement de chercheurs confirmés comme Daniel Weinstock, comme Josette Marchesso, comme Ron Rudin, qui sont aussi ici aujourd'hui. Equally important, we fund public interaction programs like the Trudeau Lectures to ensure new knowledge generated makes its way to Canadian decision makers and the public at large, because good ideas get even better when shared. At the Trudeau Foundation, we believe profoundly that the best solutions emerge when individuals from different generations and different backgrounds focus on the problem together, when technical, scientific, and policy innovations are informed by outstanding contributions from intellectual fields rich in deep cultural understanding, from ethics to literature to geography and law. And when new patterns of human behaviors are revealed and deep cultural understanding achieved. We didn't adopt this approach by accident. That's what Pierre Trudeau life work and prolific writing inspired us to do. Pierre Trudeau a dominé la scène politique canadienne de la fin des années 60 jusqu'au milieu des années 80, et qu'on l'aime ou qu'on le déteste parce qu'il a souvent suscité des passions extrêmes. C'est une figure majeure de notre histoire. It's easy to remember him as a charismatic intellectual who dressed in capes and wore roses in his lapel. However, to embrace its iconic characterization of the man does him a disservice. He was much more about substance than style. Trudeau championed bold, often provocative ideas. For instance, he promoted environmental protection and sustainability over 50 years ago, long before it became part of our daily lexicon. He provoked stimulating debates about crucial issues facing Canada and the global community, and he brought intellectual rigor to those discussions. Those who knew him says his personal motto was reason before passion. And I normally made a pose here because I disagree, but this is another story. It is this heritage that we celebrate and which we encourage a new generation of intellectuals to emulate. So how do we do it? Well, Trudeau scholars and fellows delve into vital areas that preoccupied Pierre Trudeau. The first is human rights and dignity, freedom of thought, speech, expression, assembly, and association. Trudeau was committed to social justice, believing that all human beings should be able to lead a life within society that reflects their common values and aspirations in spite of differences. Responsible citizenship, our second theme, underlines that citizens need to be engaged in public affairs for both their personal and the public good. Canada in the World, our third theme, promotes Canada's tradition of responsible engagement in international affairs. That's interesting, isn't it? And our final theme, People in Their Natural Environment, recognizes that growing competition for food, water, clean air, and natural resources is leading to conflict and inequalities. At the Trudeau Foundation, we understand that the social sciences and the humanities can contribute to all four themes, not necessarily because they provide all the right answers, but because they help us to formulate the right questions. Bien entendu, notre intérêt pour les sciences sociales et humaines n'est pas du tout un jugement sur la valeur des autres champs de connaissances, des autres domaines d'innovation. Nous avons tous notre place dans la résolution des problèmes. And we certainly don't dictate what our scholars and fellows can or cannot do. They are fiercely independent and operate at, they laugh, you see. They are fiercely independent and operate at arm's length from the foundation. We encourage audacity and creative thinking. We do, however, make it clear to grant recipients that it's not enough just to come up with innovative ideas. They must also distribute them widely. We want to make sure that timely findings are available to decision makers so that they can be translated into sound public policies. Neither do we expect scholars or fellows on their own to come up with all the answers. We pull together a multi-generational group of academic and non-academic leaders from a wide array of disciplines, creating new synergies to tackle the most pressing issues of our time. Les mentors Trudeau jouent un rôle capital dans cette communauté en ouvrant des portes, en créant des occasions de rencontres et d'échanges et en prodiguant leurs conseils. Nous croyons qu'en instaurant un dialogue entre le monde de la recherche et celui de la décision, nous pouvons contribuer à changer l'un et l'autre, et pour le mieux. Let you be the judge. Today, you will hear from one of the 2004 class of Trudeau Fellows, whose work personifies the kind of big thinking I've been talking about. To date, we have sponsored more than 25 Trudeau lectures at campuses across Canada, exposing communities to the latest thinking of a new generation of innovators and leaders. As you will hear, the world is rich with wise and creative people who can point society in new and better directions. Enjoy. Merci infiniment.
Alors, merci PJ. C'est toujours un plaisir d'être en partenariat avec la Fondation Trudeau. Je suis Graham Carr, président sortant de la Fédération canadienne des sciences humaines, et il me fait très grand plaisir de vous accueillir ici cet après-midi en si grand nombre et de présenter à notre conférencier aujourd'hui, Daniel Weinstock. Mais juste avant de commencer, je dois dire que cette conférence sera donnée moitié-moitié en français et en anglais. Alors, si vous en avez besoin, des écouteurs sont disponibles à l'arrière de la salle. The conference will be given both in English and French, so if you need headphones for simultaneous translation, they're available at the back of the room. Since 2012, Daniel Weinstock has been the MacDonald Professor of Law at McGill University, where he teaches both in the Faculty of Law and in the Department of Philosophy. And starting on the 1st of August, he will take up new responsibilities as the director for the Institute for Health and Social Policy as well. Prior to moving to McGill, to crossing the mountain in Montreal, Daniel held the Canada Research Chair in Ethics and Political Philosophy at Université de Montréal, where he was the founding director of the Centre de recherche en éthique at Université de Montréal. And as PJ already pointed out, since 2004, he has been a fellow of the Trudeau Foundation. Across his career, Daniel has published more than 100 scholarly articles on a wide range of issues in ethics and political philosophy. His current interests deal with the political philosophy of the city, health equity, and ethical issues that arise with respect to education, children, the family. It's a pretty wide corpus of interests and work. And one of the things which he's going to do today is talk a little bit about his own personal intellectual journey to arrive at these terrific destinations. An important mandate of the Trudeau Foundation, however, as PJ has already pointed out, is the contribution to public debate on policy issues. And here too, Daniel is very well known, not only in Quebec, where he's sometimes ubiquitous in the media, which is a good thing, but elsewhere, where he has contributed to important debates around issues such as religion in schools, l'accommodation raisonnable, as we say in Quebec, euthanasia and assisted suicide, and the response to the flu pandemic several years ago. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Daniel Weinstock.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to begin just by saying how happy and proud I am to have been associated with the Trudeau Foundation, and as a Canadian, to have an organization like the Federation standing for us as researchers in the humanities and social science. I think that these two institutions are really national treasures that we perhaps don't appreciate to their full degree, and I think we really should. As a scholar, 20 years into my career, I can tell you that the three things that we most need in order to do our work is time, community, and freedom. The time, obviously, to think big thoughts or maybe medium-sized thoughts. the community, which in a big country isn't obvious. Events like this are terribly important. There are colleagues whose work I read who live in British Columbia or out east, who I only get to see when I come to the Congress. And for all of the technological advances that have made some aspects of our work feasible through the internet, Skype, etc. I think that having a beer with someone on the beautiful campus of UVic, especially when the organizers have managed to get such nice weather in for us, is really something irreplaceable. And freedom as well, and something that I want to talk about for just 30 seconds of my 32 minutes. We live in a time of economic crisis where there's a perhaps natural tendency on the part of governments to want investments in the area of research to yield immediate dividends, to be able to solve some of the big questions of our time. And I think that that's entirely appropriate and something to which I've tried to contribute. But I think there's sometimes a lack of awareness on the part, perhaps, of government sometimes that responses to immediate problems really require that they be couched and that they be based on much more sort of fundamental research. If we just think about the problems of the day without placing them in a broader, deeper context, we might just end up repeating errors of the past. We might end up just giving a lot of the wrong answers. And so I worry sometimes about the degree to which, when you look at funding, it's more and more difficult for people to do what has been named, what has been called curiosity-driven research, a bit of a strange term. I prefer to think of the French word as the appropriate one, la recherche fondamentale. And I think that it's important that we have institutions like the Trudeau Foundation and the Federation affording us the ability and standing up before decision makers in the necessity for our being able to have not just time, not just community, but also freedom. I probably used up my 32 minutes, so thank you very much. So I'm very, very honored to have been asked to give this lecture. It comes at a time where I just turned 50 last week, and this September will be 20 years since I entered the profession. So as good a time as any to think back upon what I've tried to accomplish in the 20 years that I've been active in our community. The title of the lecture comes from the reaction which a friend of mine who I hadn't seen in a very long time, a colleague from Europe, when I explained to her that I had moved, both moved universities, but that I had taken up a position in the Faculty of Law and that I was active in working in the area of health and social policy, looked somewhat puzzled and asked me, so are you still a philosopher? And I thought that that would be a kind of a nice way of pitching the lecture and of reflecting myself upon the way in which, just to reassure everybody, especially my philosophical friends here, I think the answer is very much still yes to that question. But to think a little bit about the ways in which I've come to think about the role of the philosopher and the role of the public intellectual with respect to big social problems. So I come from Quebec, born and bred in Montreal. Those of you who know Quebec either from intimate acquaintance or from a distance know that we are a somewhat fractious society. We like to argue. It's a national pastime along with hockey, and when our team gets eliminated early, we get to argue even more. We argue about big questions. We argue about whether we should continue as a society to be part of this federation. We argue passionately about the lengths to which we can go whilst remaining a liberal democracy in protecting French language and culture in a global and continental context in which we are very much a minority community. Recently, we've been arguing a great deal, just as passionately, perhaps even more, about the lengths that we should go to accommodate religious diversity in our society, religious diversity which is partly the result of immigration, but also partly the result just of the internal diversification of our own society. Argument is something that came naturally to my family. My father was a former communist who was completely disillusioned with the Soviet Union after 1956. His brother remained a communist. And I remember some of my earliest memories are arguments on Friday night, either at our house or at my uncle's house, which when they really, really got passionate would lapse into Yiddish so that nobody could understand. But argument has always been something that has seemed to me to be both a very great strength, a society that knows how to argue without argument lapsing into civil war or into two communities living side by side and not engaging with one another, which is not as bad as civil war, but is still pretty bad. That knowing how to argue was something sort of really important for the health of a society. And knowing also how to arrive at compromises when arguments have to come to an end at some point, when we have to reach decisions, we have a certain time to argue, but then there's something that we have to make a decision about. Knowing how to, as we say in French, mettre de l'eau dans son vin, put a little bit of water in your wine and compromise with others has always seemed to me to be one of the most important things, one of the most important markers of a healthy society. And if I think back to my motivations for deciding to study political philosophy more years ago than I care to remember, it was partly with the hope that political philosophy could provide us with some tools with which to achieve that important societal function of helping to build the bridges that make compromises amongst members of a fractious society possible. I studied at McGill, but then went off to Oxford University to do a PhD, where I encountered a mode of doing philosophy which was both thrilling. The smartest minds in the philosophical world arguing about distinctions so fine that you really needed a kind of magnifying glass to see what the distinctions were, but also a bit frustrating because it wasn't clear whether all of those distinctions were actually immediately or readily usable to illuminate the debates that interested me in a useful manner. One of the people who had a tremendous influence on me, as people with whom one disagrees profoundly can influence one often as much, if not more, as the people with whom one agrees, was a man by the name of Jerry Cohen, a Montrealer, who occupied the most prestigious chair of political philosophy in the English-speaking world, the Chichela Chair of Political Philosophy. And he was well known to have said and told to me said to me on various occasions, Daniel, when you think about justice, right, you have to be thinking about justice in a way which would be equally applicable to Alpha Centauri. Why he said Alpha Centauri, I have no idea. As to Earth. There's thinking about justice, and then there is applying justice to the real world, and those two things are completely different, and we as philosophers do the former. Not quite in terms that stark, but pretty much. So a frustration, the thrill of working with some of the most brilliant minds in the philosophical world, but also the frustration sometimes of thinking that a lot of the exercise of those minds was not going to be readily available for the debates that interest us. Language change now. I'm going to signify my language changes with some meaningful pauses. À l'arrière de ma tête, il y avait une phrase qui est toujours restée avec moi et qui est pour moi définit un peu ma tâche. Un des grands livres, pour ceux d'entre vous qui connaissez la philosophie politique, vous savez que le livre qui a lancé à peu près tous les débats importants dans la philosophie politique du XXe siècle et maintenant du XXIe, c'est le fameux livre de la théorie de la justice du philosophe américain défunt John Rawls. Et un livre qui est à la fois fascinant et extrêmement aride, parfois, je dois bien le dire, un peu ennuyant, que j'ai lu quand j'étais à McGill, comme il se devait, et un livre de 600 pages. 600 pages. Et pour moi, la phrase la plus significative du livre arrive autour de la page 589. Vous me direz que c'est assez long pour arriver à la phrase la plus significative. Une phrase qu'on ignore parfois parce que les gens, le plus souvent, s'épuisent avant d'arriver à ces dernières pages de la théorie de la justice. Et Rawls dit la chose suivante, je ne vais pas citer exactement dans le texte, il dit « Le rôle de la philosophie politique est de réconcilier par la raison. Il n'est nul besoin pour la philosophie politique s'il n'y a pas de désaccord. Political philosophy is born of disagreement. » La philosophie politique est là pour remplir un rôle, ce n'est pas purement un jeu intellectuel, elle est là pour remplir un rôle, elle est là pour réconcilier, et pour réconcilier par la raison. Il y a toutes sortes de manières de réconcilier les gens, on peut le faire par la force, on peut le faire par la rhétorique, mais le rôle de la philosophie politique, nous dit Rawls, c'est de réconcilier des gens qui ne s'entendent pas par la raison. Et pour moi, il y a là une manière extrêmement puissante d'articuler le rôle que j'ai tenté de me donner toutes ces années comme philosophe politique, aussi bien à l'université que dans la cité. C'est un rôle pour lequel j'estime que le compromis est plus important, la recherche du compromis est plus important que la tentative de réfuter. Ceux d'entre vous qui avez connu peut-être l'environnement philosophique anglo-saxon dont Oxford est peut-être la plus pure fleur, vous savez que Le but qu'on recherche dans un séminaire de philosophie politique, ce n'est pas d'arriver à la fin du séminaire avec un compromis. Je suis rentré dans la pièce avec une idée et j'en ressors avec une idée différente qui me permet de tendre la main à mon opposant dans une sorte de compromis. Le but de l'exercice, c'est la réfutation. Il y a un philosophe politique extrêmement connu, que je citerai également, lui aussi récemment défunt, qui s'appelle Robert Nozick, qui a écrit un très important livre de philosophie politique qui s'appelle Anarchie, État et Utopie. Et dans un autre livre, il parle dans une voie autobiographique de ce qui était sa propre attitude à la philosophie quand il était jeune. Il disait qu'il avait le fantasme d'un argument dévastateur qui réfuterait son opposant de manière tellement totale que son opposant tomberait raide mort devant lui. Vision sur laquelle il dit dont il voit maintenant les limites. Et pour moi, ça a toujours été, pour tant que puisse être la volonté de réfuter un opposant à tel point qu'il n'a absolument plus rien à dire, il me semble que l'utilité de la philosophie politique doit être ailleurs et doit être celui de réconcilier. Réconcilier, tenter de trouver des compromis permettant à des gens de bonne foi, partant de points de vue moraux, philosophiques, politiques, parfois religieux différents, de s'entendre sur des questions de politique publique, sur des questions sociales, sur lesquelles ils n'ont pas le choix que de s'entendre, s'ils veulent continuer à vivre dans la même société. So this mission that I've sort of tried to give myself in both my writings and my public activity has led me to write in a voice which is perhaps slightly different from that of some colleagues in political philosophy, looking for messy, workable compromises rather than the sort of pristine, elegant purity of the positions that emanate from one principle being allowed to run roughshod over others. And it has also led me in ways which have been both fascinating, perhaps deleterious to my academic career, to accepting just about every invitation that has been given to me by governments, public institutions, to participate as a consultant or as a member of commissions in attempting to draw out solutions, compromises, which may lead our society to go forward on questions which were deeply divisive. So just recently, as was mentioned by Graham, I think, I was part of a commission struck by the Royal Society of Canada to look into the question of how and whether to decriminalize the practice of euthanasia and assisted suicide. I also spent a couple of years thinking about the issue, which I think has given rise to more sort of passionate debate in Quebec than any that I can remember on reasonable accommodation of cultural and religious diversity. And in my own writing, I've tended to gravitate towards questions that are the object of quite divisive debate. And as I've been doing my work, and this is what I want to sort of try to get across to the extent that there's a big or medium-sized thought in what I want to tell you, I've been gravitating towards a kind of argument which I really didn't realize I was making until quite recently, like Monsieur Jourdain in Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme, who doesn't realize until he's told that he's speaking prose. And the argument goes sort of something like this. So let me give this has been very abstract so far, so let me give a few examples of the kinds of debates that I've been involved in and the way in which I have tried to pitch arguments in order to allow them to achieve the role that I've been talking about of reconciliation through reason. So early in my career, I was very interested on questions that had to do with the conditions of Canadian unity or disunity. I got back to Canada in 1992. Those of you who know your Canadian history know that that was the beginning of a fairly, what's the word I'm looking for, exciting time in our history. 95 was the referendum. And the question about the legitimacy of Quebec's desire to secede was one that was debated both politically among citizens, amongst politicians, but also in the academy. Here is a stable federation, one of the most successful societies on the planet, just about according to every indicator you care to mention. And one of its constituent members is claiming that, or at least some significant members of the population, is claiming that it wants to go it alone. For some people, that's just fine. There is a primary right, say some people, to form a society with the people with whom you want to form a society. The right to secede is just, for some people, an implication of the right to self-determination, which we all have as a primary moral right as human beings. For other people, things are a lot more complicated, right? Canada, again, is a huge civilizational achievement, one which has permitted the thriving, not of all of our peoples, far from it, but nonetheless, on the world scale, a very successful society. And you really shouldn't be able, say others, to secede from such a society unless you have just cause. Unless you have just cause. At best, some theorists are saying, we have a remedial right to secession when injustices of a fairly manifest kind are committed against a group. Put the defenders of these two positions in a room and try to get them to argue it out, and you will find that whether they are academics or politicians, they will probably leave the room even more exacerbated in their holding of the initial position than they'd started off with. Years later, I became involved, as I mentioned, in the debate over reasonable accommodation. And one of the issues which tends to divide people most has to do with the ways in which reasonable accommodations affect the interests of women. For some, a veil is a piece of clothing which doesn't harm anybody else and which people should be able to choose to wear or not to wear as they see fit. The state should have no role in determining how people present themselves in the public square unless in some way they harm others in the way that they present themselves in the public square. And a veil is certainly not something that harms anybody, say the holders of a first position. Holders of a second position will say, no, not so quickly. A veil is a symbol, a tangible symbol of the subjection of women within a certain culture. And in our culture, the norm of equality between men and women has to be not just one that is written into the functioning of our institutions or constitution, it also has to be visible. We will not, say the holders of the second position, tolerate in public institutions at the very least that women wear these badges of subjection. On the one hand, you have people saying that people should be allowed to use their freedom in whatever way they see fit, including ways with which others might disagree, wearing a veil. And on the other hand, you have people who say equality of men and women is really a value that should trump the kind of tolerant view that I presented in the first. Again, put people, and this is something that I see regularly, not later than last week again, put people who hold these two positions in a room together, get them to argue it out, and the chances that they will come to any kind of a compromise or reconciliation, very, very slim. Third issue with which I have been sort of concerned these last few years has to do with euthanasia and assisted suicide. And again, you have two very sort of sharply distinguished positions which have been fighting it out in the public arena. On the one hand, you have people who feel that individual autonomy should be the governing principle of our institutions as a whole and should have an implication for end-of-life issues. If I'm an autonomous person, protected in my autonomy by the institutions of the state, then that protection should hold up until the conditions of my dying, the way in which I deal with illness, with disease, with suffering, with pain, the way in which I choose to leave this world is as important a decision for the success of my life as is the career that I'll choose to pursue or the person that I'll choose to marry or not, or whether I choose to have kids and how many, etc. It's one of the big decisions in life, and autonomy requires that we protect that decision. On the other hand, you have people who say that the moral fiber of our society depends upon our protecting the value of human life, even against the choices that some people might have to act against that value in their own case. If we start down that road, say some, it is an extremely slippery slope to an abasement of a value which really should be fundamental to our society that has to do with the supreme value of human life. Again, when the debate is pitched in that manner, autonomy on the one hand, supreme value on of life on the other, the chances that you'll get people in a philosophy seminar, in a committee room, to agree to some kind of a compromise is very slim indeed. I've seen my work, and I think I realize this now more clearly than ever, as one which has consisted in trying to change the way in which these debates are framed in order to allow for at least the possibility of reconciliation through reason. Another idea of Rawls, which I'll throw out, John Rawls, the philosopher that I mentioned a few minutes ago. John Rawls suggested something for deeply divided societies, societies which are divided according to religion, moral outlooks in a very fundamental way. He suggested that we practice something which might sound like copping out. The method of avoidance, he called it, right? The method of avoidance. If you head into a debate, and there's a way of framing the debate, like the way I framed those three debates that I just talked about, which you know antecedently the chances that it'll give rise to compromise, to consensus, to agreement are almost, they're vanishingly small. Well, you should try to avoid that role, right? When we're driving a car and we see a brick wall ahead of us, usually the right strategy is to try to turn left or right or back up or do something to avoid hitting the wall. Now, how can we reframe debates such as the ones that I've mentioned in a way that is both morally serious, but that avoids the brick walls that I've described a second ago? What I've tried to describe in my work is a way in which we might do so by adopting a strategy of what might be called the avoidance of harm or the minimization of harm. Okay? So consider the three cases that I've just presented to you. Si une constitution annonce tout d'un coup que la sécession d'un de ses membres constituants est illégale, non seulement la Constitution est silencieuse sur cette question, mais la sécession n'est pas permise, explicitement dans une Constitution. Est-ce qu'on peut s'imaginer que dans une société multinationale, le simple fait d'être déclaré constitutionnellement illégal va mettre fin à toute activité sécessionniste, à toute activité, disons, nationaliste? La réponse est certainement non. Hein? Dans une société multinationale, une telle constitution pourrait même être vue comme un affront, hein, rendant le sentiment sécessionniste encore plus fort qu'il ne l'aurait été autrement. Donc, et il est très difficile, à moins d'utiliser la force militaire, hein, de mettre fin à cette pratique. Quand un groupe a une conscience de lui-même comme un groupe national, de lui dire que vous n'avez pas le droit de considérer la possibilité de former votre propre État. Hein. La seule manière de faire de sorte que l'activité sécessionniste ne se produise pas, c'est par la force des armes. Si vous ne faites pas utilisation de la force des armes, la simple déclaration de l'illégalité ne va pas mettre fin à cette activité. Prenons le cas de l'euthanasie et du suicide assisté. Quand nous avons commencé à faire nos recherches à la commission, et c'est quelque chose, je crois que toutes les études, toutes les commissions nationales qui ont étudié cette question un peu à travers le monde se sont rendues compte, c'est que la pratique de l'euthanasie et du suicide assisté, sotto voce, sous le radar, est quelque chose qui se passe dans les hôpitaux un peu autour du monde. Des médecins, par compassion, voyant des patients souffrir, vont poser des gestes qui ne sont pas strictement légaux. Hein? Il n'y a pas de grand appétit politique à aller courir après les médecins qui agissent de la sorte. Premièrement, parce qu'on se rend compte que la plupart du temps, ils agissent par compassion, mais également parce qu'il est très difficile de détecter des gestes d'euthanasie qui sont des purs gestes d'euthanasie. L'euthanasie est dans une sorte de continuité avec des gestes qui sont permis par la loi actuellement, comme par exemple la sédation terminale. Vous avez le droit, si vous êtes un médecin aujourd'hui, avec le consentement évidemment de votre patient, tout ceci présuppose le consentement du patient, dans des cas extrêmes, de souffrance extrême, d'induire une sédation, donc d'induire une sorte d'état comateux chez un individu dont vous savez qu'il ne sortira plus jamais. Hein? Vous attendez donc que cette personne meure. On sait que la sédation terminale a tendance à raccourcir la vie des gens qui y sont exposés. Ce n'est pas de l'euthanasie parce que le rôle du geste n'est pas de tuer maintenant, c'est d'induire cette sédation qui mettra la personne à l'abri de la souffrance. Mais aller faire, quand vous êtes un avocat, quand vous êtes un policier, la distinction claire entre les deux gestes, très difficile. Donc, on a une pratique qui est en place et on a aussi bien le manque d'appétit politique pour faire de sorte que la loi qui interdit cette pratique soit mise en vigueur, et également des problèmes épistémologiques. Comment détecter des véritables cas d'euthanasie lorsque la ligne entre des pratiques illégales et des pratiques légales est aussi difficile à tracer? Alors, on a des situations, le port du voile est la même chose, où on a une pratique qui est contestée. Une pratique qui est contestée, où des gens de bonne foi voient la pratique d'angles moraux complètement différents. Une chose qui semble claire dans les trois cas que j'ai décrits, on pourrait étendre ces cas à d'autres, hein, c'est que la tentative de mettre fin à ces pratiques se soldera presque certainement par un échec, à moins, comme dans le cas de la sécession que j'ai décrite, de consentir ou de vouloir utiliser des moyens qui seraient encore pires que le mal qu'ils cherchent à éviter, comme l'action militaire, etc. Donc, vous avez une pratique qui est contestée. vous avez une pratique qui ne risque pas de sitôt d'être éliminée par la loi. Le terrain d'entente qu'on pourrait imaginer dans de telles conditions, qui sont des conditions qui sont étonnamment courantes pour beaucoup des débats de société que je ne mentionnerai pas plus qu'en les identifiant, pensez à l'utilisation des drogues, pensez au travail du sexe, donc d'autres débats qui semblent avoir cette structure-là. L'invitation qui est faite dans mes travaux, l'invitation qui est faite pour changer le sujet, pour tenter de trouver un terrain d'entente qui pourrait réconcilier par la raison, est celui de la réduction des torts, harm reduction. Given the fact that we're not going to do away with secessionist politics anytime soon in societies that are truly multinational. There will always be people who will be considering the possibility of going it alone. Given the fact that women who veil and who are driven in their veiling by deep conviction, if they are asked to stop veiling, will simply not appear in those spaces in which they are told not to appear in with their veils. Given the fact that it is very difficult or impossible to enforce or even to detect, in the case of euthanasia and assisted suicide, those actions which fall foul of the strictures in our criminal code that prohibit any assistance to suicide. Perhaps the thing that we can try to do together is to find ways in which to minimize the harms associated with the practice. And minimize the harms with respect to the very values that the opponents of the practice claim to be basing their opposition upon. When I took part in the debate on assisted suicide and euthanasia, the conviction, when you sort of unpacked it, when you sort of talked to people and tried to get them to spell out their deepest fears about the decriminalization of assisted suicide and euthanasia, the deepest fear was about something that tends to get referred to in public parlance and in academic debate as the slippery slope. Take the cases that have been talked about the most and that have been the basis of the legal actions that might, in the next few months or years, lead to the decriminalization of assisted suicide and euthanasia in this country. All these cases, the case of Sue Rodriguez, the case of Gloria Taylor, are cases of women, strangely both afflicted with the very same disease, which is known as Lou Gehrig's disease. Completely, when you hear these women, incredibly articulate, incredibly rational people who have given a lot of thought to what they were asking for. When they were asked to be able to control the conditions under which they would die, you did not get the feeling, either with Sue Rodriguez or with Gloria Taylor, of people who were acting rashly, of people who were acting because they were clinically depressed. Gloria Taylor, and this was something that was quoted quite movingly in the judgment in British Columbia, we're in British Columbia here, by the Supreme Court of British Columbia. Gloria Taylor said, "I did not want my death to be in contradiction with the way in which I lived my life." A very rational thought that I think a lot of us can understand. So the fear is not that Gloria Taylor and Sue Rodriguez will be able to avail themselves of the help of a physician in ending their lives. The fear is that vulnerable people, people who are not able to speak for themselves as articulately as Gloria Taylor and Sue Rodriguez did, people who may not have the family resources in which to have their interests defended as effectively as they did. The fear is that euthanasia and assisted suicide will come to be administered to them. So what we're worried about is vulnerability. What we're worried about is the vulnerability of the lives of those people who are already the most vulnerable. And so the question is, what kind of regime regulating the practice of euthanasia and assisted suicide is best able to cope with that fear? Is it one in which we have official prohibition, lack of enforcement, right? And therefore, a kind of reign of arbitrariness, which we have heard described in a number of circumstances, where the practice in this hospital, the practice in that hospital, are purely a function of doctors trying to do their best in figuring out what the right thing is to do? Or is it one in which we will attempt, as has been done in the Netherlands, as has been done in Belgium, right, to create bulwarks, to create institutional mechanisms whereby we attempt to ensure that only cases like Sue Rodriguez and Gloria Taylor's will be one which we will admit to assisted suicide and euthanasia, right? In order to avoid that practice being visited upon people who have not consented to it in conditions of full rationality and full information. It seems from the evidence that we've been able to glean from places like Holland and Belgium, that the answer is that we had better, for reasons that have to do with the very values that opponents of the practice put forward, we had better do the latter than the former. Regulate, decriminalize and regulate, rather than criminalize and then fail to enforce because of our inability to enforce. I'm probably running short of time, and I forgot to do that fateful thing that one does, which is to start the thing on my iPhone. So I don't know how long I have. We're close. Like how close? I'm there. Okay. Yeah. I was going to run through the two other cases to show how that logic works, but I won't do that. I'll wrap up now. So I've worked on these three areas and others besides in trying to develop a kind of way of building bridges amongst people who, when you look at their stated principles, seem at loggerheads, right? Which attempts to construct a terrain of possible understanding and compromise around the idea of the minimization of harm. Here are the values that opponents think are the most important ones to try to uphold, whatever the regulatory mechanism that we have around these practices. What regulatory mechanisms can we put in place to ensure, or to make as certain as we can, that the harms that are created by these practices will be minimized to the greatest degree that we can, including harms relative to the value that opponents of the practice hold most dear. And my hope is that by proceeding in this way through a range of important policy debates, we'll be able to do a lot better than by having the sort of abstract principled arguments which correspond to the brick wall. I'll wrap up by saying the following thing. One of the things that should be obvious to you in listening to me, and has become obvious to me as a philosopher who, Oxford trained, has tended to immunize himself from the facts a little bit, is that in order to deploy this strategy, facts matter. Facts matter. And it's important for philosophers in ways which we perhaps have not been trained to do, to reach out to practitioners in the empirical social sciences, policy sciences, etc., in order to bring our conceptual sort of articulation of the problems into contact with their research. Which of the regulatory regimes presently existing is the one that best protects vulnerable people? Oxford seminar-style philosophy will not allow us to answer that question. We need to refer ourselves to the facts. Fact-driven policy is something that feeds very nicely into the approach that I'm suggesting. It's something that we philosophers are not used to doing, but I think, and I'll end with this, that it is the way in which we, certainly political philosophers, can best achieve the function which I've described as being the one that Rawls certainly taught me, that of reconciling through reason. Merci beaucoup.
Well, thanks very much, Daniel. The one thing that doesn't compromise is time, I guess, but we have time for some questions. Si vous voulez poser des questions, il y a des... veuillez utiliser les micros à chaque côté de la salle. Don't hesitate to pose your questions in English or French, and please try to keep them brief. First question here.
Thank you very much for a wonderfully stimulating address. I didn't call a CD even once.
That's high praise indeed.
I'm with the Canadian Peace Research Association, and as you probably know, Bertrand Russell, who is considered the outstanding philosopher in the Western world in the 20th century, his last book was entitled, Has Man a Future? And as you probably know, Albert Einstein and he issued an appeal in the face of the threat of nuclear weapons. Remember your humanity and forget the rest. It seems to me that the essence of philosophy, as you say, is to be based on the facts. Personally, it's my belief at the moment that worldwide, and Canada-wide as well, we are embarked on a disaster course. I think the title of this conference is At the Edge. I think we are right at the point of going over the edge. And I think the intelligent and philosophical thing to do is to face this fact and act upon it. And I would appreciate it if you could be kind enough to comment on that, so that we can answer positively the question, has humanity a future?
Right.
Thank you.
So that's, well, the most obvious answer or comment to give is yes, but I'll say a little bit more than that. I think that there's something, so the kind of case that I've been talking about is one that is quite different. The thing that's striking about, when you think about the environmental damage that we've been doing to the planet, climate change, I think it's not the kind of thing where you will have a lot of serious people standing up and saying, well, climate change, I'm in favor of climate change, seems like a good thing to me. The problem that we have with things like climate change is we have a broad moral consensus, but we have various inabilities to act, which are born very often of sometimes just laziness, sometimes just not realizing how our own actions impact the world. But I think it also has something to do, if we want to be self-reflective and critical of ourselves, with the way in which philosophers and thinkers have addressed the problem. There's, I think that one of the issues that, one of the attitudes that flows quite naturally from the one that I've been describing with respect to a certain kind of issue is that in order to get there, you have to consider where you are here. In other words, it's no good to develop plans for saving the planet that don't take into account very robustly the kinds of infrastructures we have put in place and that would attempt to wish them away. I'll give you one example. One of the issues that I've become quite interested in, as Graham mentioned in his introduction, has to do with cities, right? The urbanization of the planet continues apace, and we have invented, certainly in North America, ways of living in the city which are disastrous, right? We're spread out. I don't know what the density level of Victoria is. It's probably quite low, my guess is. People.
Yeah, compared to Montreal.
Yeah.
It also seems like things work here.
And even Montreal is. The system of corruption. The system of corruption that exists in Montreal, I'm sorry, is extremely effective. Very, very well put together system. So,
it's efficient.
As a Montrealer, I take exception to your. No, so all kidding aside, we have extremely. We drive everywhere. We have ways of organizing city life which are extremely badly conceived when we think of the challenges that face us. Now, the thing is, we can't wish that away. We can't wish a situation into existence where the great cities of North America and the world were constructed in a denser manner. And so we have to think of solutions, creative solutions, for addressing impact on climate change that takes into account that that we have to get there from here, not there from some abstract starting point. So that's a very, very abstract way of answering your question. I think the challenges are great, but they require of philosophers and others that they take a pragmatic attitude towards them, which again addresses the question, at the risk of repeating myself, how do we get to there from here, given the fact that here is very imperfect indeed?
Great, thank you. Other questions? Yes. Can you just go to the microphone, please? Sure, yeah. And maybe just introduce yourself.
Yeah, the concept of harm reduction is very striking, something that we're familiar with in Vancouver over the injection centers, yes. And there's been a debate whether that should be extended to Montreal and Toronto. And I think that's a really good case study in which to apply harm reduction, because obviously there's on the one hand, arguments to be made against the use of destructive drugs, and on the other, a kind of compromise that takes into account that concept of harm reduction. So, any comments on that?
Well, yeah. I mean, if you talk to public health, so one of the things that I did for 4 years, which was a huge part of my education as a political philosopher, was actually accept to do something that at the time I had absolutely no expertise in, which was to become the first director of the Quebec Public Health Ethics Committee. And if you go into the area of public health, harm reduction is bread and butter, right? Harm reduction is basically an attitude that says, with respect to these morally controversial things, we're going to take a completely different attitude. We're going to prescind from moral judgment about drugs, about sex work, about gambling, about alcoholism. We just recognize that these are aspects of our environment with which we have to deal, like we have to deal with the weather. I'm exaggerating a little bit, and just minimize the impact of it on all concerns. So to the extent that, and it's striking that in the area of the academy that I inhabit, this idea has not really penetrated. Strangely, the first time that I can remember hearing a paper in which the idea of harm reduction was used in a moral political philosophy seminar to address a big issue, the issue of abortion, was actually yesterday in the CPA Congress by a philosopher by the name of Shannon Day, and I was thrilled, but really first time in ages. So I think that it's something that is that is old news to people who work in the kinds of areas that you're talking about, but I think it has potential for bridging the kinds of value gaps that I'm talking about. And interestingly, an aspect of the talk that I didn't have time to get into, I was originally told I had 3 hours, and
we compromised on that.
So there's something very interesting that's happening at the level of the Supreme Court, of the courts, not just the Supreme Court, the courts in Canada. I think the courts in Canada are, in ways which has not been, I think, sufficiently seen, in ways both good and problematic, been reading something like a right of all Canadians to fact-driven policy out of a certain interpretation of Section 7. So if you look at the Bedford decision on sex work in Ontario, which is being appealed up right now, if you look at the Carter decision in British Columbia, which is also going to be appealed up, and certainly if you look at the Insight decision, which was 9-0, right? That's a striking thing. You'll find the kind of logic in argumentation that I've been presenting being taken up by the Supreme Court as one which it reads out of Section 7. Now, there are jurisprudential debates that we could have about whether the court is the right place for this kind of evidence-driven kind of debate to take place. But it's interesting to me that there's something of the spirit of the times, which has been, something that even the court has now taken it upon itself to be a vehicle for.
Great.
Oh, wow.
Take a question
I'll
over
try to be
here.
shorter.
Well, the first question dealt with more analytical philosophy, and I'm coming at it from continental philosophy, so your mileage might vary with this question. But in terms of thinking about a commitment to justice, an actual practice of an ethics, I'm just wondering, is the issue more about disagreement or is it about dissensus? What I mean by dissensus is an actual incommensurability between perceptions of reality of being in the world, especially thinking about the difference between policymakers on one hand and people who are actually affected by policy on the other. So in this case, just thinking about like what you've already mentioned today with dealing with euthanasia / assisted suicide, or my interest in terms of thinking about politics would be something like I Will No More or Red Square.
Yeah.
You know, these people in the streets, on the ground, protesting against the state, saying what you're doing is wrong, what you're doing in fact is harming us, and some sort of way we want to work with you, but conversely, by virtue of the fact that we are working with you, are we just legitimating the fact that you have permission to harm us in some sort of way given whatever kind of policies are enacting? So I'm just wondering, in that case, how do we make sense of doing justice when there's so many different kinds of materialities, experiences, what have you, that need to be made sense of?
Yeah. That's a great question, and I'll only obviously scratch the surface of it. You know, as I work in the one foot that I have that's in the sort of policy area rather than in the academic area, I have found that actually the will to consult people about contentious policy issues is actually much higher than you might think. And for reasons which don't have to do with necessarily the moral virtue of policymakers, but, you know, policymakers, after all, want their policies to work. And it doesn't take a big thinker to realize that one of the ways in which they're going to work is if the policies are actually taken up by the people that they are deployed to serve. So the question isn't whether, the question is how. And that's where one of the challenges that we have lies. My colleague from the McGill Law Faculty, Hoi Kong, is here, and I'm involved in a research project which he's very much the spearhead of, looking at ways in which, I mean, in Montreal, whenever there's a new sort of land use project, there's a commission, right, and people get invited. But when people come, when regular folks come into a commission, it's usually structured all wrong, right? In order to glean the knowledge that they can contribute to the policymaking process. And one of the things that Hoy is doing and that I'm trying to help out with in this research project is just try to do better with respect to that. How do you actually both get the knowledge and use the knowledge? Because I think the willingness is there, but you have to undo the asymmetries of power, the asymmetry of knowledge, the asymmetry of social capital, which exists between policymakers, academics, and regular folk who are the receiving end of policies. And we haven't quite figured out, so that's more like a promissory note, but it's something which I think is on the agenda of people who are working in this area.
Thanks.
Okay, we're at one of those incommensurable moments when there are people lined up to ask questions and we're running out of time, but I have a reconciliation to propose.
3 questions and then...
No, it was, which is that there's actually a little reception afterwards outside the room, so if you would agree to take some questions from people there, then anyone who I'll take one more question, and then other people who may have questions can speak to Daniel outside the room. So.
Can't spend the whole time debating over who's going to
Okay, come on. How has that worked out?
I'll buy him a drink.
All right.
I'll buy him a drink. Thank you. I was very taken with your affirmation of the importance of disagreement for pluralist democracy, the constitutive importance, so not as an inconvenience, but as really what pluralist democracy is about. Now, not all young people grow up with the kind of dinner table disagreement that you described from your youth. And I'm from the Netherlands. I'm used to a country with a great, fierce appetite for disagreement, although we can discuss whether or not the form of that's always useful. But I've been very struck living in British Columbia by the fear many people have of disagreement and argument. There seems to me around me a lot less appetite for disagreement and argument, even peaceful but fierce kinds of argument and disagreement about important social matters that I think ought to happen. How do we cultivate not just a tolerance of disagreement and argument, but an actual appetite for it in light of that importance for pluralist democracy?
Wow. That's a huge question. I'm, as an aside, as a Quebecer, I'm somewhat surprised to hear that said about British Columbia, because British Columbia is often represented as the most polarized politically polarized of the provinces, but maybe that just means that people are polarized, they don't fight with one another or argue with one another. Let me give you a one-word answer and then maybe a 3-sentence answer. The one, I think education is an important thing, and so this will allow me to so one of the first public mandate I ever took up was with a commission that was impaneled to think about the role of religion in public schools in Quebec. When we took up our mandate, there was still confessional, religious, and ethical teaching in the schools, and we came up with our proposal was to deconfessionalize teaching, but not to get religion and ethics out of the schools, but to teach them in a different way. And this has given rise to a course which is now on the books. It's been 3 or 4 years now of éthique et culture religieuse, ethics and religious cultures. Now, after our committee sort of wrote its report, I was regularly consulted about the way in which this course should be done. I wasn't on the commission, but I was consulted, and I said, the most important thing is it can't be a milquetoast sort of, you're okay, I'm okay, everybody's great. We live in a society where, I'm a Jew, there was anti-Semitism, there was a numerous clauses at McGill until, in the 20th century. Our interactions are enriching ones, but they've also been complicated ones. They've been, we interned, Japanese people here in British Columbia, and so, kids can take dissent. They see their parents fight, and stuff. You have to teach these things in ways which aren't simply museum-like. Oh, look, there's the nice practice of these people, and there's the nice practice of those people. And that message was just not heard. And I'm afraid that there's a fear of turning, and I can understand the fear. I'm saying this as an academic who can then walk away from the classrooms that I will have created if so I can understand the fear, but at the same time, I think that I really do think that there's a nobility to disagreement. There's a nobility to people being able to arrive at common policies despite their disagreements. In political philosophy, the ideal of consensus is still one. Consensus terrifies me. I don't want to live in a society that has consensuses. Or not consensuses on certain things, but difficult issues are difficult for a reason. And so I think that the education of our children is the first path, and I can imagine ways in which the classrooms could be organized to mobilize that fund of potentially exciting sort of disagreement that there is. I can also understand the resistances on the part of ministries of education and teachers who, you can imagine a kid coming home, a Turkish kid coming home and said, Dad, is it true that, this thing about the Armenians? I mean, there's a place for that. Not sure that, it's a difficult, I still think that it's a challenge that we could do better taking up in our schools than we do. And I regret that the opportunity was not better taken up in the course that we devised in Quebec.
Great. So, alors, juste avant de remercier Daniel pour cet excellent discours provocateur, je dois souligner les contributions de nos partenaires, la Fondation Trudeau, mais même aussi la Fondation canadienne pour l'innovation and the Association of Universities and Colleges of Canada, all of whom have supported the Big Thinking Lecture Series. I also want to thank our hosts, the University of Victoria, who have provided not only the phenomenal facilities for the whole week, but simultaneous translation for the Big Thinking Lecture Series. If you came in late or you know of people who you think would be interested in Daniel's lecture or indeed any of the other Big Thinking lectures, most of them have been videotaped or are available at the Congress website, www.congress2013.ca. I'd also like to point out that Daniel is participating in a round table entitled History Under Harper, Federal Identity Initiatives in Conservative Canada, which is being jointly sponsored by the Canadian Political Science and Canadian Historical Associations, and it's tomorrow, the 5th of June, in the Clearview building at 8:45 a.m. Now, Daniel, I'm not sure if you saw, and others as well, in this morning's Globe and Mail, an article by Lawrence Martin, somewhat bemoaning the lack of engagement of political scientists from his perspective in the public domain. I understand it's triggered an active response in the Twitter sphere. I really want to say on behalf of, I think, everyone here, how much I appreciate your engagement in public policy issues. And I think in terms of what the Federation and the Congress wants to represent, the combination of humanities sensibility and intellect and social science rigor in the development of different ways of thinking about public policy. It's a really terrific merger of disciplinary perspectives, of cultural perspectives, and intellectual perspectives.
Thank you.
And I want to thank you on behalf of everyone for that.
Thank you.
And just before inviting all of you to join us in a reception outside, I'd like to ask Peter Keller, again from the University of Victoria, to make a brief presentation to you in thanks for your work, Daniel.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.